Possible mission then, our impossible mission, is to complete this type of functionality in our little Windows Universal application. So what I've done is I went on to Blackboard and I grabbed the project as we left it on Monday last week, right? So I should actually test. Should have done this before I started recording, but it doesn't hurt to quickly. I'll just load it in the local machine because it's faster, and we'll see if it's working. Oh, by the way, on the weekend, my web service was down for a little while. Sorry about that if anybody was trying to develop. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but remember I said by accident I'd created it so the website, the web service was in, I think, East Central US or something, but the database was in Southeast Asia. So I thought, well, maybe it's something to do with the connection between the two. So I moved the database to the same resource center in South Central US or East, whatever it was in the US. So that seemed to solve the problem, and it's been back up and running ever since. So hopefully it'll keep on working. All right, so so there we see our application working, right? And we can flick through or scroll through, I should say, see all of our employees, filter by department. Yeah, so everything seems to be working good. All right, but obviously we want to take this to the next step and do the kind of functionality additions that we were just talking about are needed for the next stage of the lab. So back in Blackboard, if we go to the weekly folders here, move over. What I've done is I've thrown up part 2, okay, code file. So I'll be taking code from there to add that functionality into this project as well. When we're done, I'll probably post the solution as well. All the code's really enough, but in any case. So if you grab that and have it handy, you can follow along quite easily. Okay, so one of the first changes I'm going to make, if we remember, I added one little bit of information into the code behind for our app, the app XAML page itself. What we did the other day is essentially we added a static property here just to make a nice central place to go and get the URI, right? Where we're going to go and get the data from, what web service is providing it to us. And that's not a bad approach at all. I'm just going to throw a little bit of extra code in here. I'll basically, this is repeated, so I'll just replace it. The only thing I've really done here is we've added got 2 different ones, because as I said on the weekend, my service was down, so I just ran my actual project locally. So that's something you can always do, right? If you can't connect to it on the internet for some reason, just run it locally on your PC, and whatever your port number is might be different from this, but I could just quickly comment out, alternate back and forth, and then access the WebApi. Plus, it's a little bit faster running locally as well. Well, it's surprisingly not all that much, but a little bit faster doing that. So you can go back and forth that way. Now, the other thing I'm throwing in here to app, just because it's this nice common, it's running anyway, right? So by adding some properties here, it makes it easy to kind of save some information for later, even if a page goes out of focus and so on. So we'll talk more about what I'm going to use this for, but basically, just have to add a using from my models folder, because that's where the department class is defined. The idea is that my list of departments for populating my dropdown, it made sense not to recreate it every time I go back and forth navigating from the master page to the details page, right? Why go and get it every time, right? So if I grab it on the main page and just save it, then I can just access that from the details page quite easily. So that's the only reason why that's in here. But while I'm in here, this is the kind of code that you might want to eventually move into some sort of a helper class or something. But for the same reasons that I've done the other code, something else we could quickly and easily add in here is a few kind of utility classes. One of the issues that came up is, of course, we don't have the built-in message box. But fortunately now, this is a great improvement on what we had when we were just doing phone development. There's this, and we used it in our last lab, the content dialog, right? It has all the same basic functionality, and it's not that much more complicated to use than our good old message box approach. Now I'm just getting this because of a using missing for threading tasks, okay? So I got 2 versions of this Okay, basically show message works just like message box show, right? I pass in a string for the title, a string for the message. It just gets the common dialog box up here, or content dialog box, I should say, and it's all asynchronous, so it shows it. And you'll look at it and you'll see, oh, that looks very familiar. I've been using Windows 10. Same dialog box comes up all the time in all the built-in Microsoft apps. It's exactly the same one, right? Even if you're working in Edge and go to close a tab or something and it comes up, it's this same control is what they're using. Okay, so my second version here is a confirm, right? So it returns the content dialog result. That's the only difference between the first two. And although I do actually have to add a secondary button here, now you should be aware that the content will take any XAML you want. So you can build a very complex, like form almost, to show inside one of these content dialogues, right? You can have image controls and a stack panel with all kinds of things and so on, you know, with checkboxes for options and things like that. So that's why sometimes you see these come up, and you know, like there's you can have your whole those agreements that you are supposed to read through to the end and things like that. You can do all that kind of stuff in these controls. They're very flexible, but for just basic functionality, these are the two versions I use most: show a message or ask yes or no, right? So that's the difference here. Is this one, I have a title, I have a message, two buttons. Notice the primary button is what you get by default. So good practice, this is kind of a side topic, but good practice, you should always make the default button on a confirm dialog box the no button, right? So they don't panic seeing something come up and hit enter right away and do what they don't want to do, right? Do you want to delete this person? Nah, click enter, and oh, that's it, they're deleted. So they should always make them actually take the mouse or the finger and click yes if they want to actually do something. Good practice anyway. So that just returns a task of type content dialog result. So that's just a bit of plumbing that we're going to find useful throughout our application, having that there in our app. Okay, now let's move on to our main page. Well, actually, before we do that, we know we're going to need a details page, so I might as well add it now, right? So I'll right-click. We will add a new item. Be a little bit careful here. You might be thrown because you're seeing like a XAML view. That's not what we want. Blank. Good old blank page, right? That's all we want. And I'll just call it employee detail page. Okay, if you hand in your lab and your patient detail says employee detail page, I'll wag my finger at you. Now, it's totally blank, which is perfectly fine. There's nothing on it, which is good. Okay, we'll come back to it later. I'll just let it finish loading. Oh, I should mention something. I'm sure you did the tutorials on navigation in our textbook series, the beginner series. Of course, even in our hamburger example, we used a frame where we could then navigate and show different pages in a frame. But you may or may not be aware that there is a, what do you call it? I'm tempted to say master frame, but the more technical word is a root frame of the whole application. So I don't have to create a frame to do navigation. There already is one. In fact, I should have done this when I had this up here. If you look in the app, the code behind for your app page, way down here you'll find references, okay, to the root frame, right? So basically the root frame is just the window, like if you're looking at it on a Windows PC. You know, it has the minimize, maximize, the close, nothing in it. It's just like, you know, without the Chrome, just the outer edges of the window. That's the root frame. And then, of course, you load a page in. So the code is in here. You know, check if it's empty, then it goes and finds main page. If you don't want main page, you can just change the code in here to find some other page as the initial page to load up and so on, right? Root frame, navigate, type of main page, okay? So we have this frame that's there. We don't have to make a new one. That was my point of mentioning all this. All right, so we'll be able to navigate to our details page from our main page using just, you can go this dot frame, but you don't really need it. You just have to say frame, and it'll know you mean the root frame. Okay. So let's go back to our main page now. I want to make some changes to the XAML, and then of course there's quite a bit of work to do in the code behind. As usual, I like to arrange my screen this way, because for the most part I can see it well enough on the left there and give me lots of room to see the code. So one of the things that we're going to want to do is I probably want to add as well some sort of a button to go from here and navigate to my details for adding a new employee, right? You could put buttons, you could create a hamburger menu system and so on, but the old phone, and I loved it, it had this built-in little tray at the bottom available for any application where you'd have these cute little icons and 3 dots at the end. You could swipe up to see the labels under the icons for, they call it the application tray. Well, that's gone now in Windows 10. But we can kind of get some of the same functionality back quite easily and make it very responsive using a relative panel, right? So what I'm going to do is take my main page's grid here that controls the layout of the whole page, and let's just add another row, right? I'm even going to set its height to auto. And then I'm going to just stick a panel in here to hold buttons, right? You've noticed already that I could put it right here. It doesn't matter because I say what row and everything else it goes in, but I don't know about you. For me, I like to arrange the XAML kind of in vertical order, even though it doesn't have to be. It just makes it easy for me to read the code and understand. So I'm going to go right to the bottom of the page here, inside, okay, the very last main grid here of the page. And that's where I'm going to stick a relative panel. Okay, so grid row 2, of course they now 0, 1, 2, that's the third row from the top. To stick a relative panel with a button here, of course it's not going to find the actual click event just yet, but I'm going to put the content add employee, just a little bit of margin around it, and just using the relative nature of the panel to make sure it's centered from left to right. Okay, so that just, you can even see it showing up here if you can. From the back of the room you probably can't, but you know what I mean. I see the button down here at the bottom. Okay, that's the first little thing I just wanted to take care of. Another thing is, in hindsight, I'm wasting a lot of space at the top of the screen, or of the page here. Like if I even go to 50%, I know I'm only seeing part of it. But I could improve upon this a little bit here, this company app. I don't really need to say employee list. This is a minor cosmetic thing, but just to explain what I have in my code. That's all in this title panel, stack panel, right here. So I just modified it a little bit. This is in my copy paste that I've given you, just to take up a little less room. I kind of like the look of this rectangle. It kind of gives you a horizontal line, stretches to fill the screen, so on and so forth. Okay, just takes up a little less room. All right, now the main thing, I encouraged you as a bonus sort of to get away from, the trouble is, just make sure it still runs, that I haven't broken anything here. Using a list, okay, perfectly fine on the phone, right? Trouble is, if you're going to try to make it look anything better, and I hear some of my students have done even a better job because I'm not even worried about really the look of it right now. But the point is that the, oh, did it not start? Huh? Oh, of course, there's a whole bunch of build errors. I should have known. Okay, the thing is, the list, it goes down the left-hand side of the screen, right? That's not a very good arrangement at all when you have a full screen to use. So that's one reason why I put in my instructions for part A of the lab. Why not look at the grid view instead? Now for the grid view, actually I'll do it wrong so you can see how to do it right. But okay, basically I just want to replace the whole list box, right? So I'm just going to take that out, and I'm going to put my grid view in my cheat file. It has you do this in the other order, but I'll throw my grid view in here, right in the same place, right? So it's a grid view. Now, mind you, it's complaining though that it doesn't see my template. Now, I could define the template right inside the grid view, but that's not the usual approach. You'll find that most developers, at the very least, try to simplify the code you're looking at when you're kind of reading through the XAML of the page by doing a bit of segregation of the code. So things that are templates and so on are often put as resources to be called, right? So I'm going to go up to the very top of the page, even above the grid, and throw in here a little section for page resources, right? It's just a way to kind of organize things, because there might eventually be, in some pages, multiple controls that will utilize the same item template and so on, right? You could actually use this in different types. It's not just a grid view. You could use this data template and so on in different situations. So I just have a stack panel here. Notice that I'm using X binding still. Okay. Full name and the position, just as we had it. By the way, this was a bit of a trick. When I first went to use grid view, I didn't realize it wasn't shown in the tutorial in our beginner series that without a width, it just automatically tries to resize every cell to the content, and so things get out of alignment. They go all squiggly all over the page, and so by setting a width, though, then they line up nicely, right? So that's good, okay? But this is still complaining. If you have watched a couple of videos, you'll notice that sometimes, because this pre-compiles, the problem is the resource wasn't there when I had this code. So the trick is, and you get this as well with X binding sometimes. It'll underline your X bind expression. Okay, all you have to do is remove it and paste it again. It's just a little quirk in how the pre-compiling works, right? So that's enough to make it say, okay, now I know what you're talking about, because it compiles it as you insert it into the page. So it didn't have the resource the first time, so it never could find it. Okay. Eventually, they'll probably make it smart enough to go and relook again later. But right now, that's the quick and easy fix. Yes? No. Because build doesn't do, the pre-compiling is a totally separate process. So you'd think that building would fix it, but no, it doesn't. Anyway. All right, so there we go. So that's our grid view. And that's good. Now, of course, there's a lot of errors because I have references to code and the code behind. So let me just address that next. Let me bring up the code behind page. And, there's not a lot in here, and it's basically going to be the same. I could fix this a bit at a time, but you know what I think I'm going to do is I'm just going to basically replace the code for the page itself from my copy paste file here. And we'll just talk about it, right? So everything right down to here. Now I'll just see if I build properly. Ah, okay, that's because I'm missing a using. Okay, same code I used in the hamburger example. I just don't want it to rotate to landscape, right? So this is one way to do that. You can set that as a global property of the whole application, but if you just want individual pages, you can do it this way. Okay, so that took care of my one build error. All right, so let me talk about the changes in the code. So what we have here, I'm still filling my drop down, okay, as part of the initialization process. And in page loaded, I'm still showing employees. That's exactly the same. I added a little bit of code here in the fill drop down for the departments, right? Sure enough, we're using our repository. We're going getting all the departments, adding our all option, same way as we did before. But here is where I'm going to the app, right? Remember, this wasn't a static property, so I actually have to instantiate an app object. Otherwise, I could just access it directly. But because I don't want it to be static, because I need to be able to change it. I can't do that, so I just have to do this extra little step of grabbing the application.current as app, and then I can fully access that spot to store the collection of all the departments. Okay, and then I set it to the item source of the combo box like usual. That just gives me, as a side step, the way to kind of tuck it away for future use on other pages. Okay. Show employees is exactly the same, except of course I changed the name of the control displaying it, right? I think we'll run it now, and we'll come back and look at the rest of the code in a second. I'll just make sure that we're doing okay. So once it gets the data, there. So you see the difference, right? Using the grid view, it certainly, I mean, obviously could use some borders and colors and, you know, a graphics person to make it look pretty, or somebody who has a nice tutorial you can steal from online and how to do that, like Paul, right? But, you know, at least for now, I certainly see it using the screen a lot more, right? And of course, as I get narrower, okay, then the grid view is quite adaptive. It eventually ends up looking very much like a list after all, right? But away we go. Okay. Now I can click my Add Employee button, and I think the code is there now to navigate to. There's my details page. Oops! Of course, I haven't put anything on it yet, so there's nothing there. And there's no way to get back, okay? Back button doesn't do anything, so there you go. How to shoot yourself in the foot, and then, you ever read that code snippet on how to, anyway, it used to be up in the M201. It was like how to shoot yourself in the foot, written in various computer programming languages. And, you know, some of them like took like 20 lines of code, you know, assembler, right? You know? Anyway. All right, so we shot ourselves in the foot. But anyway, let's come back and talk a bit about the code that we've put in here. So obviously now we have all these items, right? Back in our XAML, you noticed here that I said, is item click enabled? True. And we have an event handler for item click. We could, actually, it still works to use the selected changed, like the selected index change type event, because it is still a list control at its heart, right? It does inherit from something similar to that. So that does still work, but this seems to work a little better. So most of the tutorials seem to use this approach with the grid view. So just item clicked. And so what do we want to do when we click on an individual employee, right? Well, really all we have to do is use our frame to navigate to the employee page, right? But as you saw in the tutorials on navigation, I can even pass information as I navigate forward and back. So I'm just passing the clicked item cast as an employee. Remember, the binding for this was just that it would be an employee, right? I'm sure I'm only showing certain fields, but each item basically is an employee as far as the system is concerned. So I just cast it back to an employee from a grid view item. Okay, using the data template that facilitates this, and away we go. So I'll just pass the employee over to the page. So all I have to do is set up the catcher's glove to receive that employee and work with it, right? So it's really quite elegant and simple that way. That's just for filtering by department. That was the code we had there last week as well. And just my button add click, right? Now, truth is, I started off just using binding because it was an old habit, and then I switched my details page to use the newer Xbind, so it's pre-compiled for better performance. You know, when we talked about the difference before, I mentioned that Xbind, although it has advantages being faster, it's also not quite as robust as just the older binding expressions. It's a little fussier about things, and I started to get an error, which I wasn't getting with binding, but using Xbind, because when I created a new employee to pass, because in fact all I had here was new employee, right? I didn't even have a separate line of code. I just would pass new space employee bracket, right? The trouble was, when you do that, the fields are all take their defaults, right, or null. So the date would be null for the employee start date. And that worked with binding, but it didn't work with Xbind. So that's why this extra bit of code is here. I just create the employee object first and set the start date so it actually has a value. That's the only one that gives an error, right, using Xbind. But good thing to know going forward, right? Okay, so then we're just passing my new employee object. So one way or the other, I'm going to navigate to the employee details page, either with an empty employee ready to add, right, or with the employee that was selected. So there's two ways to get there. Other than that, this page is pretty much the same as it was, right? Yeah. Okay, so that's it for that page for now. All right, so let's focus on our new page. So we have the XAML and we have the code behind. Now, I to be honest with you, I think in this case, rather than try to build it a step at a time, there's quite a bit of controls here and so on, so to try and copy and paste them one at a time doesn't make a lot of sense. We'll just go through and discuss them all as I think our best solution. Okay, so just finding where I'm at. All right, so for the employee details page, I'm going to get the code first, just because things complain if you don't have event handlers. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. So we'll go to the code behind page, and I'll just select all and paste. A couple things under, well, of course, because the controls aren't there yet, so references to the controls it's going to complain about. All right, now here in the XAML, invalid markup. Hang on. Okay, so I have a couple errors because I'm missing something referenced in the XAML. Notice that I've added a namespace here called converters, right? It's just looking for a folder called converters in my application. I haven't made that yet. And also down here in page resources, again, I'm adding a couple of converters that I can use. Now, what are these converters all about? Basically, I'll explain what they're for. If I scroll down, I know we aren't getting a view because the markup's invalid. But basically what I have, right, is we're only dealing with one record at a time, not multiple records, right? So I've got a bunch of rows set up, okay, to show the different individual fields, okay, in this grid. And basically I have text blocks and text boxes for the most part, right? And the binding here is just xbind, you know, the first name, last name, so on. Notice it's set to two-way, so it automatically communicates changes made in the control back to the property of the object itself, right? Which is even more powerful if we were using an observable collection, because then it can use this notify property change event to actually update the database directly and things like that, you know, if there is. But we just have dumb objects, but still, it does automatically update the property with the binding. I don't have to write any code to copy text out of text boxes and assign it to properties, right? So it's definitely a step in the right direction. Okay, but there's two tricky ones. One is my date picker, and that's the main one that I had to make a converter for. Because the problem is the date picker, its internal data type that it works with is a datetime offset. But of course, my employee object has a datetime property for its start date. You know what? C# is very fussy on data types, right? It doesn't just automatically say, oh, I know you're kind of like this guy, so I'll convert for you. So we have to provide a converter. So an I-value converter is any object that implements the I-value converter interface, basically has a convert to and a convert back, right, methods, and that's all there is to it. So that's what I've done, is I've had to add these in order for the binding to work, right? Because I'm binding things that are slightly out of alignment. And I took advantage as well for my salary. Where's that one here? It's it's the last text box, salary, right? So in the binding, I go xbind, okay, it's the salary, and I'm using a convert currency to string converter, right? Now, it was a nice thing about using this. I had to use it for the one way, right? But actually, as well, I put some code in there so, you know, it'll strip out, if people type the number with commas, separators, and dollar signs and so on, I just strip all that out in my code as well. So it's kind of an added thing that you can throw in since the event's there anyway. Why not make use of it, right? So that's what I have to do to make this finally work and make it happy. So let's add a folder. Add new folder, just a folder, and we'll call it converters. And I'll add a couple classes. So a date time to offset converter. I stole some of this code offline. I mean online, you know what I mean. Okay, so the idea, of course, of any one of these is obviously I want to make it public. And I wanted to implement I-value converter. Now it says, what the heck are you talking about? But I can just control period to add Windows UI XAML data. It's still underlined because, of course, now it's offering to implement the interface, right? So there we go. So it created a convert and convert back. So all I really need to do is come in here and put the code in place. So I'll do a try here, right? If value is null, return null. If it's a date time, okay, we'll just basically convert it and send it back, okay? If we can't convert it, then we'll just send a minimum value so that it has something there anyway. On the way back, just reversing the process with a try catch as well. Okay, that's good for one. So this is really necessary just for the binding to be able to work automatically going from two slightly different data types, right? So I'm going to do the same type of thing. I'll add another one. For my currency to string. As using, implement the interface, and just put our code in here. So I can format it nicely as currency, right, on the way in, as it goes into text. And then on the way back, I'll strip out any unwanted characters, do the conversion, and away we go. Okay. So now that those are there, I wonder if I'll actually be able to build. Let's try it out. I'll never know if I can't see the output window. Oh, there we go. There he is. So you can see what the layout looks like here, right? So we're just dealing with one employee at a time. So I just have got these rows laid out in the grid, okay? So we're binding to the first name, last name, the title. I have a drop-down list of departments, a salary text box, and we're using the, well, it's basically like a date time picker control. It's actually named, though. I have to look again. Date picker, right? There's other controls you could use as well. You could play around with different calendar controls and so on that are part of the framework, but this is a very common one, and it's certainly nice and easy. So there we go. Now let's have a look at the code behind, because that's where most of our work actually is done. These are just getting the XAML controls in place with the right binding expressions. But looking in our code, well, I think I just did that there so I'd have a... Okay, so the idea of X binding is you can bind to something exposed in the code behind, right? So I just called it view, kind of like view model, I guess is the idea. So I'm binding to that. So as I load, of course, I'm filling the drop down. There's my code to keep it from going landscape. So when I fill the drop down, though, it's a slightly different approach. Let me find it. I should have used the tool to help me find it. Okay, it's relatively easy. Again, I just instantiate the current app as an object, so I can grab this dot active departments, right? So I don't have to go back out to the internet, to the web service, pull the data from Southeast Asia again, right? I just pull it out. Now the only trouble is by now it's added that all option, right? And I don't want to show that in this case But that's easily removed here just with a little where, right? So, because I know the ID of that artificially created department is 0, right? That just removes it out of the collection. You could probably find a better, more elegant way to solve that problem, but that was just the first thing that occurred to me, so it works. Okay? So now I set the item source in my combo to all the legitimate departments to choose from for assigning or editing an individual person. Okay, so that's the first thing there. We go back to the top, right? So we call that as we initialize. Okay, so because we're navigating to and back, a lot of the work is actually done just in the events related to the navigation itself. So the onNavigated to, right? It has the E object. Well, remember we passed in an employee object as we navigated to this page. So that lets me grab that parameter and cast it as an employee, and there we go. Bada bing. Now I have my view object, which I'm binding to, and all the code in the XAML itself, right? So I just set that to the data context, and actually I've got it done more than one place, but that won't hurt. I just noticed. Okay, so if basically the ID is 0, what does that tell me about the employee? I guess it's there in the comments, isn't it? It's a new employee, right? That's why I can just reuse the same page and quickly decide, is this a new employee that we're adding or one that exists that I'm editing? Just check the ID. If it's 0, I know, right? And so I figure I might as well have my little delete button at the bottom disabled, right? Because I shouldn't try to delete when I'm just creating a new employee anyway. So just a good little small thing, but add quality to the user experience, right? So that's basically all we have to do on navigated to, right? I'll come back to the save in a minute. And yeah, I guess that's it. So that's all I really have to do. I should talk about the buttons next. So I have 3 buttons at the bottom of the page. Okay, I have cancel, save, and delete. So as we just discussed, the delete button is disabled if we're adding a new, but it's still there. It's visible. It's just disabled. The other 2 buttons, the cancel is the easiest. Because cancel just says go back, right? And we can just use that frame that's provided by the system, just go back, automatically takes me back. Sometimes people wrap this in an if to check if you can go back, right? But you know, it wouldn't hurt. I could have put that there, but I know I got here from there, so I should be able to go back, and that just cancels whether I'm adding or whether I'm editing, because it's not going to save anything, right? So it's essentially a cancel button. Okay. The delete button, right? So if it's enabled, then I know it's an existing record, right? So here is where we want to confirm, right? So I'll set up a couple strings, the title and a message, and then here's my that confirm dialog method that we added to our app object, right? That's a nice, easy location. Because it's static as well, I don't have to instantiate an object for it. I can just say app dot, and away it goes. Now it is, of course, asynchronous, right? So it will return a content dialog result, whether they clicked the yes button or the no button, right? So it's nice encapsulation of that functionality into that separate method. Okay, so then I just check the result. If it's the secondary button that was clicked, which is yes, then I know they want to delete it, right? So we just use our employee repository. By the way, important to remove the actual child department object whenever you're sending these up there. The foreign key, the department ID, is important to leave in place, but I found it's good to remove the actual object from the child. For one thing, it cuts down the payload of data you're sending, right? But more importantly, sometimes it can cause issues, especially when you're adding or updating, because sometimes you actually add a second copy of the department because it will Entity Framework is so good at creating a transaction, and remember how we saw if you added with our many-to-many, added a whole collection of child objects to a main object. When you send it off to save changes, it would automatically make a transaction, add the parent and all the children, right? Well, same idea, so you'd end up getting duplication of departments in this case if you didn't remove the department before ever sending it back again. So there we go. We just call our delete employee from our employee repository that we created last week, and that's all there is to it. Then we go back, right? If there's an exception, we can't delete the employee, for example, then I just want to show a message. You remember last week when we made our repositories, I said, you know, I'm being really lazy here with my try catch. The error handling just says throw, which essentially, anyone who thinks about it knows that really means I don't even need to bother with the try catch, because if all I'm doing in the catch is throwing the same error anyway, why even have it there? Just kind of a habit, I guess. But truth is, there is a way to actually try and capture the exception and pass it back, but it involves like 20 other objects and a whole bunch of code. So for what it's worth, I'll just assume that I just want to tell them I couldn't delete it, rather than telling them why I couldn't delete it. Okay. All right, so that's our delete operation. We talked about our cancel operation. The only thing left really is save, right? So when we click our save button, I'm using the old-fashioned approach to doing validation. I'm just calling a separate method that returns true or false. Is employee valid, right? I pass our view, okay, which of course is my current employee. Now, thankfully, because of the binding that's going on, I don't have to worry about, before I pass it off to be inspected, checking, you know, if it has all the values, because that's looked after automatically with the binding. It's always immediately updated with any change to any of the controls. So when I pass it off here to be inspected by my is employee valid, I'm good, right? So that will be set up to return true or false. That has a out parameter as well, a message, and away I go. So if it's valid, then we come in here and we're good, right? So again, I clear out the department before I send it back, and just use the employee repository to do either one or the other. Add employee if the employee ID is 0. Again, I can still know if it's a new employee I'm creating, or if it's not 0, then I'll use the update employee method. That way I'm utilizing everything for both operations, basically just deciding at the last minute, is this an add or an update as well, based on the same criteria. And once more, frame go back, right? Of course, I'll show a message, again using my app.showMessage, right? My nice centralized little method there. Error saving employee. So the only thing left really is this to have a look at. Let's just go to that definition. So this is written in the same style that I first taught you guys to do JavaScript validation on, I think, that pizza order form, right? If you remember that from years ago. Okay, I set an assumption that everything is okay with a Boolean, yeah, is valid, true. Set up a string to build up a list in my message here of all the problems on the page. Okay, same approach we've done before. And then just a series of ifs checking, okay. For example, string is null or white space for the first name, the last name, the job title. So, I'm not checking everything here. I'm checking key properties, and that's all I've asked you to do. Figure out what you want to check on your patient to make sure you have a valid patient. I want to make sure there's actually a department assigned as well, right? If I get through all these ifs and none of them were true, then I know everything's good, at least that I've tested, so I can just return data valid is true, because it still is. That's what I set it as an assumption, and it's inside each if I set it to false. So if none of those tests failed, it'll still be true, right? But of course, in each test as well, I can add up more and more content to the message to give back to the user. So that's all part of the save process, and it's pretty simple. And that's all the code that we have here, right? So let's just test it out and see if it works. Oh, there's one other thing, right, that we'll get to, but we can test it first, and I'll show you. I'll wait till we have data. Now if I click add employee, it should come to my page here blank, right? Now of course the date, I set it to today's date in my code as I created this empty employee object, but I can just start adding a new employee. What do you want to call our new employee today? Sam Smith. Now if I click save right now, notice delete is grayed out because we're adding. If I click save, I get my invalid values message, right? Fix the following, job title required, must be assigned to a department, right? Job title, bit of everything. Department, I can pick out of the list here. Oh, I think he's a human resources guy with a name like that. What's his salary? He must make $1 million, right? Start date, well, I guess he is starting today probably. Oh, maybe it's tomorrow actually, so we'll pick. By the way, I did do a little bit of styling in this control just to make sure it shows the day of the week with the number. I always kind of like that, right? So when I pick out a given day that I can see what day of the week it is. Okay, so let's see if we can save Sam Smith in Human Resources. And there we go. There's Sam Smith right there. Job title, a bit of everything in Human Resources. So we successfully saved. Now we can update. Oh, that's only, I must have missed a zero. That's only $100,000. So I can go anywhere in here to the left of the decimal, add another zero, and because of my type converter, it strips out all the extra characters before trying to convert. I should have done something so you'd see a difference here, but I'll go back in once more. You can see it did actually successfully change that to $1 million. Woohoo! It's good to be able to do a bit of everything, isn't it? Pays quite well. All right, so we can see we can do all of our changes. Now, of course, can I delete? Yes, I can. Confirm. Now, if I panic and press enter, I clicked the don't do it button, right? But if I actually really mean yes, I want to delete Sam Smith, then I can show his name in my message here as well, right? Then it will actually delete him and he's gone when we come back. So, you know, that I know this is, as I said, it's not fully professional ready, right? Because we're not even storing any of the data locally, really. And the other issue is on things like a phone, when a phone call comes in, right? What happens to your app? It gets suspended into the background. So actually there, you probably noticed there's an on suspending event in the app, so where you can put code to persist your data out to the local storage, you know, maybe serialize all your objects so when you come back to it again, you can load the data back, that kind of code. You know, there's a lot, much more we can do here, but at least for now it's working, right? And we can actually do our CRUD operations and away we go. Now one thing though, if I'm over here, if I select Dave Rubble and I'm editing him, one of the common things people like is a back button. We don't have it here, right? Let me just talk quickly about this as well. If I stop this and take time to load this in the mobile, this will take a moment. So while it does, let me bring up something. I put a, oh, retry, thank you. I put a link up in the notes with this code paste file that if you go to the internet, any browser will do. One of the fairly recent changes they've made to the Windows 10 Universal apps, even in our videos, he talks about, you know, adding a reference to specialized APIs for dealing specifically with the phone hardware versus different kinds of hardware, and putting if structures in your code to check what kind of device you're on. Well, there was such a common request to handle the fact that some hardware devices like phones have a back button built in and some device families don't, and on those ones that don't, it's a lot of work to set it up and actually provide a software back button, which most people like. So they've done away with all the effort, and this article talks exactly how to go about and do it. So I just followed this code. You can follow it yourself. You can do it for one page with 2 lines of code, or you can come down here and he shows you how to actually add code into your app code behind page to automatically take care of it, right? Because the issue is, oh, it's still waiting to actually load the application here. Installing missing frameworks. It will be up in a moment. Trouble is right now on a phone, if I use the back button, say I'm in the employee details and I just want to cancel and go back, it takes me right out of the application, closes it completely. That's what the phone does by default, unless you override that and catch that, right? So I'm showing you this so I can show you that. Almost there. Okay, so there's our company application. See, the grid view works very nicely on the phone. Obviously, you'll only get one column, but I can click an individual one, go to the details, right? And away we go. Cancel. Go back and see my list again. Click up and down, filter and everything, right? Trouble is, if I'm in here and I click the back button, as I said, it takes me right out of the application, which is not really ideal. So the solution to both is actually pretty straightforward. Following that tutorial I just showed you, I have the link for. Basically, you know what I'm going to do? To save time, I'm just going to replace all the code and the code behind, because it's faster to do that than worry about finding the individual spots where you copy and paste the code out of that online tutorial. But basically what we're doing is we're using the System Navigation Manager, right? And it can override and provide all the functionality that we're really after. I'll run it on the phone again. And the difference is, say I go into Tim Brown here, if I click the hardware back button on the phone, now I'm coming up, okay? Confirm, cancel. You're certain you want to leave this page, and any changes you've made will not be saved, right? So code reuse, I'm just reusing that same method to get this dialog box up that I've been using for my other, even my delete confirm, right? And I'll say yes. Somehow it's got that stuck there now. But notice the difference. If I click cancel, it just goes back, which is perfect, exactly what I want, because I already know I'm canceling the change. But if I'm here accidentally and just go back to this, I'd want to confirm it, right? Go away. Well, I guess I could move the phone. That gets rid of that. Okay. Yes, I want to leave the page and go back. Now, of course, a more elegant solution would be to actually check if any of the data has been changed and only stop them. Like, if nothing's been changed, I really don't have to worry. I could just let it navigate back, right? But that would involve, again, if I was using an observable collection, that would be easy. I could just check if the object's dirty, right? If any properties have been changed, it becomes dirty, and that's quite easy to do in code. But because I don't have that, I'd actually have to write code everywhere to check and see if anything's changed, so I just didn't bother. Okay, well, I'm going to leave that emulator up, but I'll show you the difference as well when we go back to the local machine here. Then when I click on employee, see it automatically adds a back button because it sees I've navigated forward, and it's quite elegant, and it's automatic. It works, in a large application with multiple pages and different layers you can go to. It just takes care of it for you, automatically adds the back buttons and so on. So, and again, I've got the same code in place here to say, are you sure you want to do this? Yes, I do. I don't need that if I'm just clicking cancel, because clearly I mean to cancel and I'm going back. One other last thing. I don't know if you noticed this, but the alignment of the datetime control. See, as the page gets narrower, how it moved over. So, did anybody look at the tutorials on adaptive triggers and visual state management? Okay, I think they're around 40, tutorial step 40 in the online. Besides using totally separate views for different device families, you can easily add what are called adaptive triggers. You can trigger, basically, it's very much like our media queries you're used to using with HTML, right? And with Bootstrap, for example. Whereas, if it's on a large, extra large, medium, small, right, you can change properties of things in response to those changes across the sort of the media boundaries, where you get to define your own visual state triggers and adaptively say, okay, well, if we're in a large device or a medium-sized device or whatever, I want to change these properties of these elements of the page. So it makes it totally flexible in terms of doing responsive design. So I've added a little bit of code in my page here that takes care of that. Just that, obviously, this looks good, over the left in a narrow screen, it's okay. Certainly you want it right to the left on the phone, because otherwise there isn't room for it, right? But as the page gets wider, I thought it looked better moving over a little bit and being in line with the actual text boxes rather than sticking over to the left, right? So I used an adaptive trigger for that, and you can change the width value where it changes. So that is done in the XAML of the page, of the employee detail page. Might look a little intimidating at first, but it's not that bad. So here I've just added a visual state manager, okay? And so basically it contains visual state groups. So you define each group, basically they're inside each are setters and triggers. Triggers are like our media widths and so on, right? So I set a minimum window width, in this case I set it to 600. So if it's below 600, it's not going to trigger this at all. It's only when it gets above 600 does it trigger this visual state. And then if this is triggered, then here I can put as many different setters as I want. But all I really did is I set the start date picker, right? Its grid column, right now it was set to the very left column, so it was over the left of the screen. I just changed it and moved it one column over, right? That's all I did, just moved it over a column if it's a wider screen, if I've triggered that it's above the minimum width of 600. So that's all there is to that. And then you can add as many of these as you want. There's examples online, you know, where you can actually change an entire layout from a 3-column, you know, down to 2, down to 1, and quite easily just using these adaptive triggers. So it adds even more flexibility. There's a whole section on adaptive triggers in our beginners series tutorial as well. So it's quite easy to do that kind of work. He prefers to write all the code, but you know what? I had tried to write my own code, and it wouldn't work. So I deleted mine, and he does do one demonstration using Blend. So Blend is actually, I like Blend. It's a learning curve, but it's a nice tool. I know some students used it because they couldn't get their the designer to work because of one reason or another in their Visual Studio, but Blend would always work. So you can take any page you want, and so for example, my employee detail page, I can right click and say design in Blend. It opens up in the Blend tool, and it's a much more graphically oriented editor, right? Really designed to focus on XAML, and gives you a lot of, it's the best way if you are going to create any kind of animations and so on. Blend has all the like the storyline, timeline tools and so on, you know, so you can have things flip and rotate and change color and, you know, make all these neat visual effects and so on. And that's all done in Blend. So here I'm opening up my page in Blend. So you do get the designer. Oh my, what's this? Problem updating your online license. My trial has ready to buy Visual Studio? Okay, I just never entered my, I've got the enterprise version on here, I think, and I just have to enter the code that I got from DreamSpark. I just have never done it. Well, let me just close it. Okay. Anyway, I can give you the actual tutorial where he shows using, and I use Blend to make this visual trigger because I had trouble getting it manually. So, you know, you just basically highlight it, add visual triggers, set what properties they are, and then it records. You can go to your page, say, well, I want to make this change, and drag this around and change this property, and it records all those changes for you as new settings inside the trigger, and just saves all the code for you. So it's really quite nice. Anyway, that's it. That's all. That's everything. Any questions? Okay. Well, I think you're ready to do your next lab.